Good morning, church. It's good to be with you. Looks like I got invited back, I guess, so we're here for round two. I guess my goal with this, with Acts chapter 9, kind of the overall theme would be like the title, as you see up there, A Changeless God Who Changes Us. And I think the best way for us to get a picture of what that looks like is to look into the person of Saul, like his personality and his past being the two main things that I kind of want to dive into. So we're going to start it off with a little game, all right? So I'm going to give you a list of some people, and you're going to tell me what they all have in common. So first one, FDR, good guy. Bill Gates, Gordon Ramsay. Now here's a curveball. Joseph Stalin. And then we have Winston Churchill and Mark Cuban. Does anyone have any idea what these people might have in common at all? If not, totally understandable, right? There's a lot of contradicting characters in there. But the one thing that they all share is actually their personality type. And the personality type that I tend to use the most, the one that I'm most familiar with, is called the Myers-Briggs personality type. I know you probably can't see that from all the way back there, but basically they cut every person basically up into 16 different personality types. There's 4 categories, each with 2 letters, and you're one or the other of all 4 of the categories. So walking through them, the first one, you're either an extrovert or an introvert, right? That probably makes sense, right? The second one, you're an S or an N. You're either a sensor, like people. A sensor would be a person who tends to focus on the details, are more detail-oriented, whereas the N would be more of a big picture, likes to pick up on patterns, things like that. Then the third one would be you're either a T or an F. You're a thinker or a feeler. This one needs a little bit less explanation. Either you like to think through things logically, debunk them, analyze them, or you just get a gut feeling and you go with it. And the last one, you're a P or a J. You're either you tend to prospect or you tend to judge. So P's would prefer spontaneity. They're flexible people. They are able to go with the flow, whereas J's like to have things planned out in a certain order. And if you couldn't have guessed, all of those people on that list earlier are this ENTJ category. So this is known as the commander type. These people are very strong-willed, energetic, confident. Those are considered their good traits, but at the same time, their weaknesses are that they're intolerant, impatient, stubborn, and oftentimes they're cold-hearted. And as you can see with those people on that list, right, you can totally see like someone like Mark Cuban, who is definitely an extrovert, right, outgoing, has all these connections, seems like a nice guy, but he can be pretty cutthroat, right? He's a businessman, right? That's what he does. So it's just kind of interesting, for me anyway. I fall in this category as well. I know several other people do, but it's a pretty small percentage of the population. Like, this is a pretty rare, it's less than 1.4% of the global population falls under this category. Obviously, this is speculative, as most of those people haven't actually taken the test, but it's kind of widely agreed upon that those people fall under the same category. So why did I just spend all this time explaining to you some personality tests that you might not even go home and take or use in your life? Well, I think in our lives, just from like a human mind perspective, it gives us insight to the people around us, right? It helps us understand their thought processes, how they go about a problem, like how they will receive you speaking to them, things like that. In result, it'll enhance our communication with one another. If we have an understanding of what people need or want or are expecting from us, then it allows us to communicate more effectively with them. Some people don't want to be talked to, right? That'd be like your introvert types. So just things like that. And ultimately, it helps us grow in our relationships with one another if we can understand what people are expecting from us and what they need. But the real reason why I spent all this time talking about this is that this is actually Saul's personality type. Where's it at? There we go. So my goal here is to kind of get us into the mind of Saul and see how he processes information, how he acts, reacts, and deals with the people around him. And like I said earlier, this type is a very assertive and direct type. Assertive, confident, stubborn, self-disciplined, and oftentimes is intimidating to the rest of the population. And the problem with that, this can be a very good thing, right? A lot of those people on that list that I showed you at the beginning are very good people. Maybe not good people, but they do a lot of good for the world, except for Joseph Stalin, obviously. But yeah, so you can kind of see both sides of the story here, how it's a very polar personality. And we see this with Saul, right? Not only with Saul like before his conversion, but after. You can see that he's just totally on fire for God after, right? He wrote all these books about all these letters to different churches to help grow the church. And ultimately, he's passionate about his work. He's a doer, and he has a fiery desire for success, right? The problem with it all is that he's using his God-given gifts and abilities for evil, right? He's actively persecuting the church, as we can see here in chapter 9. As like in the first verse here, you can see, hopefully that's big enough. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats to God's church, right? And not only that, but he's actively seeking out ways to persecute the Jews, right? He just got done in Jerusalem, and now he wants to head all the way to Damascus to do the same thing, to persecute the Jews. But there's still another piece of the puzzle here besides his fiery personality, and that is what I would want to dive into here. This has more to do with Saul's past. So hopefully you have a general understanding of who Saul is as a person, now diving into his past. So Saul actually grew up in the church. He was familiar with it. He was around it all the time. He was taught by a rabbi named Gamaliel, and I feel like Gamaliel is kind of an underrepresented name in the scriptures, in the Bible as a whole. He's widely regarded as like the best rabbi to ever teach in Jewish tradition. And Saul had the privilege of learning from Gamaliel. And through that, it ended up fostering a great love and desire to know the law and to uphold the law. That's what Gamaliel did. He taught the law, and Saul knew the law very, very well. Moving forward from that, knowing that Saul has a background in the law, I'd like to jump into Acts 7, actually. So this is a little bit before Acts 9. Just kind of glossing over it, really. But this is where we see the stoning of Stephen. So Stephen was a guy who loved Jesus, right? He was standing, in chapter 7, he's standing before the Sanhedrin testifying that Jesus is the Messiah. The Sanhedrin wasn't having any of that, so long story short, they ended up stoning him. The thing that I want to draw your attention to is there in verse 58, it simply places Saul at the scene. These stonings were massive, like whole group stonings. It wasn't like a couple people were throwing stones. It was like the whole church was throwing stones at them. So that kind of hints that like Saul is kind of like approving of Stephen's stoning. Then moving into chapter 8, we actually see it directly in the first verse. And Saul was there giving approval to his death. And then if we continue through that, we ultimately see that he just persecutes the church in Jerusalem, right? That's what we see in chapter 8 as well. And the kind of crazy thing is, to me, is that he kind of feels justified in all of this. He approved of Stephen's death. He felt like Stephen deserved to die for proclaiming Jesus as Messiah. And I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? Like if he was taught by Gamaliel, right, had this huge background in the law, he would want to uphold the law. And this whole Messiah thing kind of would make the law less of an importance. So now I think we're probably ready to jump into chapter 8. So yeah, let's jump into chapter 8 here. Or sorry, chapter 9. All right, so at the beginning of Acts 9, we see Saul, like I said, Saul breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He goes to the high priest and asks him for the letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found anyone there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So, as you can see up here, Damascus is quite the trek from Jerusalem. It's approximately 170 miles. It's a 62-hour walk. That's around 3 days, a little less than 3 days as it is, so I have no idea how long that would have taken. To put it in our perspective, that would be like a little less than like me walking over to Adventureland with nothing but hatred for all the Adventureland employees for some reason. So, I mean, then that kind of gives you a picture into his heart, right? He's willing to travel all this distance just to show how much he hates the believers that believe that Jesus was the Messiah in Damascus. And he's a smart guy. Damascus was likely the second most populous city for the Jewish population at the time. So he was going to the right place for his goal, right? But all of us know that was not how the story ended, right? Instead of him going and persecuting all the Jews, we can see in verses 3 through 6 a divine intervention. So I'll read that quickly here. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go to the city, and you will be told what you must do." So we see this, and it's kind of eye-opening, right? All of a sudden, Saul has this goal, right? And if we remember from what his personality is, he's going to do everything he can to accomplish that goal. Now, he's blinded, right? He doesn't eat for 3 days, he doesn't drink for 3 days, and he can't see. So if you remember from earlier, he got a list from the chief of priests with all the names of the people who belong to the Word up in Damascus. It's kind of hard to read a list if you can't see. It's also kind of hard to identify the people that you're after if you can't see. So to me, this seems like a big wake-up call from God to Saul. And ultimately, this results in some big changes in Saul. So if we continue on, we see, like in verse 9, for 3 days he was blind, did not eat or drink anything. And as I was reflecting on specifically that 3 days thing kind of stuck out, because that should kind of ring a bell in a lot of our heads. Who else was dead for 3 days, was unable to do anything for 3 days? Well, that would be Jesus, right? Jesus died on the cross, was buried, dead for 3 days, and then when he was brought back, literally everything changed, right? We had no more need for atonement. Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. And there's lots of parallels here with Saul's being figuratively dead for 3 days, right? Unable to carry out the tasks he had set in front of him for himself, right? Dead for 3 days, and then when he is raised back up through Ananias, through God, we can see that he's turned from a cold-blooded killer into this man who's just passionately on fire for Christ just in 3 days. Like everything about him changed in that time that he was dead. And ultimately, it changed the course of the church for all of us. It changed everything for the better. One thing I would like to look at that I think doesn't probably get enough attention in this is also the change we see in Ananias. So further on, we can see it verses 10 through 15, essentially. That's God's interaction with Ananias. And what happens is God calls Ananias to visit a man whose only intentions, only reason for coming to Damascus was to try to kill him, right? So let's just put that into perspective. That, like, the best thing that I could come up with for like a parallel to this would be like a Jew in like the mid 1940s approaching Hitler and like healing him. This guy wants nothing but for you to die because of what you believe. But somehow, some way, through God, in my opinion, he trusts God, and he's able to step back and see the bigger picture and see that God is in fact doing something larger. God has a bigger plan than whatever Ananias' thoughts or ideas were for it. And we can see his initial reaction here in verse 13, right? He says, "Lord, I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and he has come here with authority from the chief of priests to arrest all who call on your name." Ananias is aware of this, but somehow he still gets over the fact that this man's out to kill him and everyone, all of his loved ones, but he still trusts and obeys. Moving back to kind of the change that we see in Saul, it really got me thinking, like, how often do we actually see someone that's truly evil, like, turn to good? Like, it just kind of, it was hard for me to come up with examples for this. Like, yes, it happens. God is moving. God is at work. But I just felt like it was uncommon, right? I think the best example I could come up with for this type of thing was like addictions, like addicts being freed of whatever they were addicted to, right? Jesus somehow turns that addiction around and they're able to turn to doing good. But other than that, it seems rather rare. And on the flip side, what about a good person turning to evil? Well, it seems like that's all we see nowadays, right? It feels like you might have a close friend, a good friend, and then he goes down a path and never returns, right? It just feels like this is just the story we see in this world over and over and over again. So why is that? Well, there's a really obvious answer right off the bat. It's that sin. Sin exists. Sin is real, and it's a part of everyday life for all of us. And to kind of paint this picture in the same way we see Saul being raised from evil to good, I thought the best example was from Isaiah, the morning star, more commonly known as Lucifer, right? In Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 17, we see Lucifer being cast out from heaven because of his jealousy, essentially, of like looking to God and wanting what he has, right? He longs for his power. And ultimately that leads to his demise and is cast into hell, right? And that's something that I think a lot of us can probably identify with on a certain level. It's very easy to look at what we don't have and want it, right? That's jealousy. That's part of our everyday lives. And also, being a human nature, we really love short-term gratification. And especially us Americans, too. We are like very impatient people. We want something and we're going to do everything we can to get it right away. And we even see that in Saul's nature as well, right? It's very common. And to kind of dig this a little deeper, maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but I hope this paints a better picture for you. There's a company or research group called Psychology Today, and they did a study on like the human brain and how our minds process and deal with like short-term gratification and things like that. So I'll read this quote from them now. So it says, "Our brains are constantly changing in response to what we and the things we pay attention to do. For example, each time we impulsively eat an unhealthy snack or buy something online, our brain pathways for these actions are reinforced and strengthened, making it easier to fall in the same patterns the next time around, harder to break the cycle." And the bad news for us, well, this is just our mind, right? But sin actually works the same way. If you think about it, like if anyone remembers the first time they lied, right? You get away with one, right? And you lie to your parents about something or whatever. That brain passageway is like physically linked now in your brain. And all of a sudden it becomes a million times easier to do the same thing again. And again, and again. No matter what it is, that's how our brain functions, right? It's literally in our design to make things easier for us once we do it. It's like starting a habit, basically, except habit can go either way, ultimately. And I think this deserves an even deeper dive. Maybe it's not considered deeper, but into something that we know is spiritual warfare and kind of the reality of sin working against us in our lives, our human desires working against us in like every aspect of our life. And C.S. Lewis, who's a famous author, I think summarizes this better than anyone else. He wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters. I don't know if any of you have read that book or not. It's a great book. It was like the one of two books that I actually read in high school, and it's a 10 out of 10 recommend. Great book. So the premise of it, for those who don't know, is, how do I do that? Okay, so you have your big, like, ultimate, like, Satan demon figure, and then you have below him his, like, little minion demon figure, and then what they call as the patient, which would be like us humans, and then the enemy is like off to the side, and that would be God in this case. So the premise of the book is that you have this big demon guy writing a letter to his minion demon guy to try to inform him and teach him to how he can best tempt, distract, draw the patient, the human, away from the enemy or God, right? So it's a totally new perspective, for me it was anyway, to look at things through the lens of Satan, right? Like him actively like giving tips to someone on how to make you stumble and fall. It's an amazing read. It's amazing write on C.S. Lewis's part. So I want to read a brief snippet from that for you today. So he says this, and remember, this is big demon writing to the little demon on how he can best tempt a human. So he says this: "You will say that these are very small sins. You no longer need a good book, which he really likes, to keep him from his prayers or his work or his sleep. A column of advertisements in yesterday's paper will do. You can make him waste time not only in conversation he enjoys with people he likes, but in conversation with those he cares nothing about on subjects that bore him. You can make him do nothing at all for long periods of time. You can keep him up late at night, not roistering, but staring at a dead fire in a cold room. All of the healthy and outgoing activities which we want him to avoid can be inhibited and nothing given in return, so that he may say, as one of my previous patients had said on his arrival down here, so that would be like a past human arriving in hell, essentially, says, I now see that I spent most of my life doing neither what I ought nor what I liked. It's kind of eye-opening stuff. There's one last passage that I think is even more powerful than that. So he says this: "You will say that these are very small sins, and doubtless, like all young tempters, you are anxious to be able to report spectacular wickedness," kind of like what we were seeing in Saul earlier, right? "But do remember, the only thing that matters is the extent which you separate the man from the enemy. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out to nothing. Murder is no better than cards if cards do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, the soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, and without signposts." This is just super eye-opening stuff to me, right? It gives us an insight into the reality of Satan literally hard at work, right, to draw us away from God. And this is totally real. And I think this is ultimately why it's so hard for us to see people turn from evil to good, right? It doesn't happen all that often, right? With the exception of Jesus, ultimately. And truthfully, this is why we need God right here, right? We have Satan hard at work, working just as hard to draw us away from God as God is trying to pull us back to him. And that's what I find fascinating about this, because back in Acts chapter 9, right, we see that all of these odds, all the things that we just talked about, right, are totally stacked against Saul and against how he would be brought back to doing good. Like as we talked about at the very beginning, right? He has this unconforming personality that doesn't like to fold to anything, right? He's strong-willed, and he wants to do what he wants to do, right? Not what someone else would want to do. And then, as also we learned, the evil to good switch doesn't really happen, and that's just like a fact based on how our brains function and sin existing in the world, and then as well as the spiritual warfare piece. So how does this apply to our lives? Well, ultimately we're in the same shoes as Saul is, right? The odds are stacked against us as well. Whatever our personality type is, it doesn't really matter. Everything in this world that is of the world, right, is stacked against us from making that switch from evil to good. And I think it's near impossible for us to do that on our own. I saw a quote in the bulletin today from Timothy Keller. If you want to look at it, you can. It says, "Certainly we should be very active in seeking God, and Jesus himself called us to ask, seek, knock in order to find him. Yet those who enter a relationship with God inevitably look back and recognize that God's grace had sought them out, bringing them into new realities, bringing them open to new realities." And I think that also speaks into this, where ultimately we are just like incapable of making the switch on our own, right? We are fully reliant on God to change us for the better. And that's what we see here in Acts chapter 9, is we have a divine intervention to make the switch for Saul from evil back to good. And he uses other people to do it, but ultimately it still happened, right? But what I find to be interesting here is that Saul's personality didn't change. When his name changed to Paul, he still had the same personality type, the same commander type that Saul did earlier, right? He still was a driven person. He still was goal-oriented. He still was probably very annoying to his peers around him for how on fire he was for Christ in his time, right? But what's more fascinating here is that God changed his identity ultimately. Instead of his identity being found in the law, placed in the law, he was able to show Saul, now Paul, the light, right? He can see that now, instead of having his identity in the law, he puts it in Christ, who essentially redid the law, almost, basically. And it's super powerful what we see in Saul, and then how we can apply that to our lives, right? We're, like I said earlier, we're just unable to do that on our own. We are just fully reliant on God and his power to make that switch for us. And ultimately, that's what salvation is, right? As Josh alluded to earlier, it's us claiming Christ after we're done with this world. So, in our lives, the things that I think that we need to be ready to do, based on what we have learned from Saul's conversion and how we function as human beings, right, is that we have to be ready and willing to let God change us and work through us, right? Last time I spoke, I talked about how God doesn't change, right? He's simply, that's one of his characteristics, right? He doesn't change his character, but he is capable of changing ours, right? The moment we switch from putting our identity in something else into him, we see a dramatic shift in our lives. And most of us in this room have probably already experienced this to a certain extent, which is why I included another point. We should also be more than willing and ready to help change others, right? As we can see here, we have Saul and Ananias, right? So Saul was changed through Ananias by God, in a sense, but we need to be fully prepared to do both. Whether the change is happening in us or we are an agent of Christ performing change in other people, we need to be fully prepared to do both. And it's hard. It's not easy, right? It's easy for us to do what we want to do instead of what Christ wants us to do. But ultimately, we can have hope and strength in the truth in Acts chapter 9, right? That God has done it before and he will do it again. Ananias felt probably as unprepared as anyone in the world to be ready to perform a change or to assist with a change of a man like Saul's identity. But he did it. He trusted in God, obeyed, and ultimately created a man who was the cornerstone of the church, right? He wrote all these letters to all these churches, spread the word to not only the Jews but also the Gentiles, all throughout basically that side of the globe, right? We use all kinds of his writing in our churches, right, with structure, and ultimately he's just incapable of making that switch on his own without Christ doing that through him and for him. It's really powerful stuff for me. I hope that you can apply it into your life, and just be fully prepared to be the Paul or be the Ananias in whatever God throws at you, and be obedient to him, be willing to set aside your own interests, your own desires, and let God change you or allow you to change others through him. You bow your head and pray with me. Dear Lord, thank you for this morning that you've given us. Thank you that you've allowed us to gather together as a community of believers. Lord, I thank you that you are a changeless God who changes us. I thank you for your Son who allowed us to find that ultimate change, the life change that you call us to. I thank you for Saul and the person of Paul after the change, right? That you used Ananias, and then used Paul as an instrument to do your work on earth, and that we may learn from that and apply it into our lives. Lord, I thank you that you are on our side. I thank you that you're for us. And I pray that we would all be a beacon of light to those around us in a dark world. In your name, amen.